6 in the Pre-Purchase Fundamentals of Pre-Purchase Homebuyer Counseling class, and this section will be over credit reports. So let's start with just some general information about credit reports. If you're not familiar with the credit bureaus, there are 3 major credit bureaus. They are Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian. In the past, there were smaller regional credit bureaus, but nationally, these are the 3 large repositories of information. So the credit bureau's job is to collect individual information, and we'll be going over what information is included in a credit report. There's a lot of information that has to be tracked. So credit bureaus are these big repositories of information, and then that information is sold to potential creditors, potential credit grantors. It also is sold to consumers. Consumers are eligible to get 1 free report each year, but if you want more than that, you do have to purchase it. It's important to understand that the information is provided to the bureaus by third parties. So the credit bureaus are really only as good as the information that they receive. So they're relying on this third-party information so that they can compile these credit reports. And that's why I call them just the repositories. They're obtaining that information, they're sorting it, they're providing it in a report format. We'll be talking about credit scoring. So they have scoring models where they'll be scoring the different credit reports. But it's really important to know that, the credit bureaus are just compiling and assorting and refining information that's provided to them by creditors and lenders. It's also really important to understand that there could be differences because since these are all 3 competitors with each other, and they're all 3 relying on information provided by outside parties, there's no guarantee that they're all 3 going to have the same information. So it's not unusual to find, for instance, that Equifax has a trade line that is not picked up by TransUnion or Experian. So this is why in pre-purchase housing counseling, it's really important to make sure that you do get a copy of all 3 of these credit reports because you could be dealing with some different information. Not always, but sometimes. And you may have a service that compiles a credit report for you that's composed of all 3 of these reports. And so you may have what's called a tri-merge. That can be useful because it deletes out any duplicate information. So using a tri-merge for mortgage counseling purposes can be useful, but at a minimum, you should get copies from all 3 credit bureaus because the information certainly could be different. There's different ways to obtain a credit report. You can order it directly from Counselor Max or Home Counselor Online. It'll be provided at a fixed cost. And what's really great is that if this is the way you are ordering it, it's going to automatically import that information directly into the client file. So it's going to make life a little easier for you if that's the way that you're obtaining those credit reports. You also could have the client bring in a credit report. This can be a little problematic because you've got to make sure it's recent. You want to be sure it's been pulled within the last 60 days. And if you're having your client bring in the credit report, you really do want it to be the tri-merge that also includes the FICO scores. That can be a lot to put on a client. They may not really have the capability of obtaining that. If you're going to have the client obtain it, you're going to have to provide some very specific steps, or you're going to have to do it with them and make sure that you're getting the correct information. You can have them go to annualcreditreport.com, not freecreditreport.com. That one's not the same. The only approved source is annualcreditreport.com, and they can get a free copy of their report from all 3 bureaus once a year. If they're going to go through annualcreditreport.com, they will have to pay for the FICO scores because that is not provided with the free credit reports. That is a separate charge from all 3 credit bureaus. Now there's always the question of who pays for the credit report. Does the client pay or does the agency pay? And this is going to be something that your agency has to decide. You're certainly allowed to pass that cost through to the client. You can't profit on it. So if your cost for the report is $12, you have to charge $12. But it's certainly one of those pass-through costs that is allowed. It's just going to depend on how your agency sets it up. If you're providing pre-purchase homebuyer counseling, you may have a set fee, and you say this fee covers the cost of all credit reports pulled. So if you want to do it that way, you can go ahead and have it included in the contract with the client. But many agencies just go ahead and have the client pay for it each time that they have to access that information. Some agencies do absorb the cost of pulling the credit report. If they have funding for their pre-purchase homebuyer counseling program, they can just build it into that funding expectation that this is going to cover the cost of those credit reports. So it really just depends on how your agency wants to model that. But I think the main point here is that you are allowed to charge for it as long as you're only charging the actual cost. There are a lot of questions related to how do we come up with a credit score? What goes into it? It's kind of this mysterious black box. And so we're going to talk in general about how we come up with a credit score, because we do know the major factors, but I have to tell you there are hundreds of factors that get considered. So there's no way to really know all the different factors that are taken into consideration in a scoring model. And in fact, the three different credit bureaus are actually really protective of their scoring model, and they don't want all the factors publicized, because then anybody could take that information and compile a credit score. But we can talk in general about what factors influence a credit score. So let's do that. So you can see based on this pie chart, the biggest section, the kind of aqua color blue, would be payment history. Okay? So payment history really is the #1 factor. Are they paying everything on time? That's the biggest piece of that pie there. The next biggest percentage is the purple slice, and that would be amount owed. Okay, so you can see, look at that. That accounts for 2/3 of their credit score. Are they paying things on time? And how much do they owe? Really big impact on their credit score. Now the other slices do have an impact, so let's talk about that. The green, 15%, represents the length of history. So how long have they had these credit accounts? This is why frequently recommendations on credit scores will tell you don't close your oldest account, because your oldest account gives you that length of history, and that helps you with this 15%. So having those established long-time relationships will help your credit score. Now the red, the 10%, represents new credit. And this is usually something that's going to score you down. If you've been obtaining new credit, it can have an impact on your score. So that's something that's going to be a negative going into the credit score. And then the types of credit would be, do you have a lot of department store debt? Do you have a lot of collection agencies? Are you dealing with a lot of, if you've got some high predatory loans out there, if you're dealing with agencies or companies that charge a high amount of interest, then that's going to be a negative going into the credit report. If you've got revolving debt versus closed-ended debt, so that is also going to impact the credit score. But you can see the biggest thing here, and I just can't emphasize that enough with clients, is that the amount that they owe and whether or not they're paying it on time is really paramount to what's going to drive their credit score. These other things are going to make a difference, and it could increase it a little or decrease it a little. But the key factor here is how much do you owe, and do you make those payments on time? That's really 2/3 of that credit score calculation. Now the range of credit scores is pretty broad. On the low end, it's going to be 300. On the high end, 850. So that's a pretty big range, right? And again, remember those factors that determine that credit score. So a perfect score of 850 is going to be somebody who has a perfect payment history. They've got a very low debt-to-income ratio, so they don't have a lot of debt. They've had their accounts for a very long time. They're not obtaining new credit, and they don't have anything that would be categorized as kind of a high-risk or high-cost loan. So a big range there as far as credit scores. And in your books, we break this down for you on page 26 if you want to follow along in your manual or take some notes there to get a little more information. So let's talk about what's included in a credit report. So there's going to be various sections that are included, and we've got some visuals here to help you understand how a credit report is going to be broken down. So the first piece of it is going to be client information. And this is going to be all the basics of the client information: first name, middle name, the address. And it's also going to have residence information. If you look at the bottom there, you're going to see that any prior addresses that they have listed are going to also be in this section. So this is really just kind of a snapshot of the basic factual information that we know about the client. There's also going to be a section on public records. So this would be any bankruptcy filings. This is essentially what's going to be listed in public records, would be any bankruptcy filings. Employment information would be included. Most files are going to have at least the last reported employment information, and sometimes this will go way back. So depending on how long they've had a job history, there could be a lot of various employment information that's been reported here. So when somebody applies for credit and they write down their employer, that information is provided to the credit repositories, the credit bureaus, and so that now becomes a part of their permanent client file. There's going to be a summary section. And so in this summary information, this is before you get to all the individual trade lines, because that'll show up too. But this summary section is going to give you, for instance, over on the left, a general summary. What's the oldest trade line they've had? Who's the oldest account that they've had? Do they have any public records? How many inquiries have been made in the last 90 days? It'll have a summary of late payments, 30 to 59 days, 60 to 89. How many times have they had payments that are 90 days and over? So this section is really just going to be kind of a snapshot of everything that's included on the credit report, because you might be dealing with pages and pages of information. So this can be helpful just to give you a general sense of what you're dealing with. And then you can go digging a little deeper, for instance, to find those late payments and when they occurred. There's going to be a section on aliases and inquiries that they've had. So an alias would be if you've married or divorced or you've changed your name for any reason. There's going to be multiple listings of names. If you've got credit inquiries, it's going to show up here. So if you've applied for credit in the last 2 years, all inquiries are going to be reported here. And these would be hard inquiries where you're actually applying to obtain credit, not what we would call soft inquiries. A soft inquiry is something that's only done by the consumer. So that's only going to show up on the consumer's version of the report. If the creditor is pulling it, these are only going to be hard inquiries that show up in the last 2 years. You're going to have all the account details. So you're going to be able to see who is the creditor, when was it opened, when was it last active, when is the last time that the creditor reported, is there a high balance, or what was the high balance, have there been any late payments, and what's the current status? Is it past due right now? How much is it past due? And then you're going to have specific information about the balance. The other thing that's not showing unless you look down toward the bottom here is the payment. So this is also going to include, if you look down there toward the bottom, it'll say past due $40, payment 0, balance $40. So this happens to look like a collection account. It's a one-time $40 bill that they never paid off. You can see under payment, it's listed as profit and loss, which is indicating to you that it was a collection account that went to a charge-off status, and that's what profit and loss indicates. It's a payoff of $40. This is not a revolving type of credit. Okay? That's why under installment it says unknown, because there really is no installment. It's just they had a bill with Verizon that they did not pay. So under account details, you're going to really see that complete information for all of the accounts that they have open. There's also going to be information on referrals. So where did they get the information for that report? In this case, this is a tri-merge. So you can see that the information sources are all three of the different credit reporting bureaus. So you're going to be able to see where that information came from. Now we talked about credit scores, and you're going to get a lot of questions about how do I improve my credit score? You know, I've only got 550. I want to get it up to 620. So how do they do that? Well, it's going to depend on their particular credit report as to what you might recommend. So in this example that we've got on the screen here, if their issue is that they have too many revolving debts, maybe they have too many or the balances are too high, well, what would you recommend? They could consolidate balances. So if they've got 10 different Visa cards, they might go ahead and roll all those balances into one. My preferred strategy would be just to reduce the balances. And that way you have, it doesn't really matter how many trade lines you have if you don't have balances on all of them. Sometimes clients can negotiate lower rates. You have to be careful when you get into all the balance transfers. That's not necessarily a good thing on a credit report, but sometimes not so much transferring balances. Sometimes what can be helpful is just calling to negotiate lower interest rates, and that way they can pay it off a little more quickly. Definitely you want to advise the client not to open any new accounts, and probably what you'll find is don't open new accounts is going to be something you list on just about every single action plan. Unless you're dealing with somebody who has no credit history, for the most part you really don't want any client opening new accounts. So then, if they do these things, they could improve their credit score because they are going to have fewer outstanding balances. They're going to have a longer history because they're going to go back and say, well, how long have you had these accounts? And therefore, they would be at less risk in terms of credit scoring. So this information, if you're following along in your manuals, would be included on page 34. And you can get a little more information about long-term ways to improve credit scores. But remember that pie chart. 2/3, 65%, almost 2/3 of a credit score is derived from how long have you had the accounts, have you had a good history, and how much do you owe. So the best thing our clients can do is pay their bills on time and make sure that they don't have too much debt. That is critical. Let's go ahead and talk about some specific things that you might see on a credit report. So you may see collection accounts. Remember that Verizon example that we had up earlier? That one had not been sold. That was probably originally with Verizon, but it could be sold. So that Verizon account might be sold to another collection agency, and this is very common. You could have multiple collection agencies attempting to collect on a debt. They're all trying to get paid. So sometimes it results in multiple trade lines when it really was just one Verizon bill. It was just sent to 6 different collection agencies. So you do have to be able to identify if this is really the same account, it's just been collected on by multiple entities. And so that's not unusual. That also means that you have to watch the current balance might not really be anything, might not have anything to do with the original balance. So for instance, that Verizon bill may have started at $500 and then it was charged off once it got down to $40 for whatever reason. Maybe they didn't pay the last $40. And then it could be that that's sold to an outside agency. So now you've got Verizon at $40 plus you've got ABC Collection listed at $40. So you just have to be able to kind of weed out those multiple things. And sometimes the credit reporting agencies will do a pretty good job of linking those accounts, but it can be confusing and is not always easy to really identify. And it's very confusing for clients, particularly with collection accounts. It can be difficult for them to keep track of everything. As far as recommending what a client can do to pay off these collection accounts, a couple of tips here. It's best really not to agree to monthly installments, because with a collection account, they're not reporting each of these payments. They're only going to report one time with the final payment. So if you agree to pay it off in 12 months, you're really not improving your score for 12 months. Until you get to that 12th payment, you pay it off, now it gets updated. So it's really best not to try and do any of those monthly installment agreements. Now the exception to this would be a client who has a large balance. It's not something they're going to be able to pay off all at once. Then they might agree to pay it off over 6 equal payments or something. So there are some exceptions to this, of course. There are times that a client can negotiate a settlement, and a settlement would be where they negotiate with the creditor to accept less than what's owed and consider that a full payment. So it's important that if you do negotiate that amount, that it gets paid. And if they're negotiating a settlement, make sure that you get it in writing. You'll see the bullet point here that says request a letter from the agency stating that the account has been paid. I would tell you also want to get it in writing. If you make a settlement offer and they accept it, be sure that you've got that documented and in writing. If they do not report that it's been paid off to the credit bureau, of course you can submit a dispute to the credit bureau, and hopefully that would be updated and taken off the credit report or noted that it was paid in full. Some lenders might make an exception for outstanding medical debt, so they might be willing to not report it to the credit bureau. So now medical debt is not reported for 90 days. So it's not reported as soon as it gets 30 days delinquent. They don't send it out to collections as quickly as they do other types of debts. So medical debt can be kind of its own little category here. Judgments. Judgments would be a court-ordered judgment to pay something. So a judgment is always going to involve the court saying you owe this, you have to pay it, and we're going to enter this judgment against you that you owe this particular amount. Outstanding judgments are going to have to be paid before somebody's going to get approved for a home purchase. And the reason is that if there's an outstanding judgment, that is one step away from a garnishment or seizing a savings account. And so outstanding judgments really present a pretty high risk that the client's going to have some troubles down the road. So that's why in pre-purchase housing counseling, you're going to have to deal with those outstanding judgments. They're going to have to be dealt with prior to purchasing a home. And particularly if you're getting a mortgage loan that's an FHA product, if it's going to be insured by the federal government, they will not make any mortgage loan if there's someone with delinquent federal debt. So that would be student loans, if they've got taxes that have not been paid. So, and I would recommend, even if they're not getting a loan with a federal government-backed loan, any mortgage lender is going to be reluctant to make a loan with someone who has delinquent federal debt. So those are going to have to be dealt with. So depending on the source of the judgment, it's a higher priority if they've got federal debt that's now reached judgment to get those paid. And judgments do stay on a credit report for 10 years. It's a long time. So judgments really, once something has gone to court and a judgment has been entered, those definitely can be hurtful to a credit score because they do stay there for a long time. Now, we are going to always see bankruptcies. That is just, you know, unfortunate, but you're going to be dealing with some clients who have had circumstances where they did have to file a bankruptcy. So we're going to be talking about Chapter 7 bankruptcy, and then in the next slide we're going to be talking about Chapter 13 bankruptcy. So Chapter 7 is essentially a total discharge of unsecured debt, and most lenders are going to require 2 years from the discharge date before they allow someone to get a mortgage. Now this could be different. I've worked in some communities where every lender wanted to see 3 years after a bankruptcy. But the general rule of thumb is you're going to have 2 years from a bankruptcy before you can get a mortgage approved. And that's because the lenders want to see that you've reestablished yourself. They're going to hopefully have been able to reestablish some credit during that time and just traditional trade lines. We don't mean these high cost loans, but just trying to reopen some traditional trade lines. It's also really important, if you look at that third bullet point, that in those 2 years, they don't have any late payments. Because the whole idea of a Chapter 7 is this idea that you are going to have a chance to start over. And if you file a bankruptcy and then you're still not paying things on time, then that bankruptcy really didn't change anything or fix anything, and a lender is still going to be reluctant to extend any credit, because even if the bankruptcy is 3 years old, if during that 3 years you've had a lot of delinquencies, they're still going to say no. Now, Chapter 13 it's just a restructure of the debt, and then the client makes payments in a Chapter 13 bankruptcy. Frequently, this is done because there's a lot of secured debts, maybe a mortgage. So with the Chapter 13 bankruptcy, the client is put on a court-ordered repayment plan. It's usually between 3 and 5 years. And so the client enters into that Chapter 13 agreement and says, I'm going to make payments for, just say, 5 years. So if they're doing that, they may be considered eligible for a mortgage if they've made 2 years of consistent payments and everything has been paid on time, they have no other delinquencies. It's possible that they could be eligible for a mortgage at that time. The trustee, the bankruptcy trustee, would still have to approve any purchases that would be a credit extension because the client is still in an active bankruptcy. So in an active bankruptcy, the trustee is overseeing that case and would certainly have to approve any purchases because they would have to make sure that it does not jeopardize the bankruptcy. Okay. You also may run into or even recommend that a client consider a debt management plan. And sometimes you'll see these abbreviated DMP. So that just stands for Debt Management Plan. And this is just where a third party manages the repayment plan to consolidate their debt and pay it off. And it's usually a 5-year repayment, although clients can certainly pay extra or pay early. But typically it's set up over a 5-year repayment time, and the client makes one payment to that third party, and then the third party distributes it out to the various debts that they have. Now, some lenders may view this negatively. As far as credit scoring, just being on a debt management plan is not going to negatively impact the credit score. But if they miss payments, that's going to impact the credit score. So what I have found helpful is if you have a client who's been in a debt management plan, get a letter from that agency and ask for, account history. So that way they can say this client entered into the debt management plan on such and such date. They've been active for 36 months. They've never missed a payment. So sometimes it can be helpful to get that third-party documentation of the repayment plan. Now, if there are mistakes on a credit file, there's going to be certain information that you have to have in order to dispute it. So that information is going to include the credit report where you found the mistake, or if you're disputing information that should not have been listed, the client's social security number, date of birth, their current address, and you're going to have to list information about the disputed item. And you're going to have a reason for the dispute, whether the balance is wrong or they never did pay it late, or sometimes it's not even their account. So you can say, not my account, and so that information can be verified. And every now and then you run into a report that has a client's personal information wrong. Maybe they have an address listed where the client never lived, and maybe that address had some delinquent utilities that went to collections. So sometimes they have to provide proof that, look, I never lived there, so how could I have had delinquent utility bills at that address? That's not accurate. So disputing information is going to be a paperwork trail. You've got to make sure that accurate information is supplied so it can be updated and hopefully corrected. Now, there are times when you've got to turn to the use of alternative credit. So I mentioned earlier, you might have a client they have no credit. You go to pull their credit report, there's nothing there. That could be because they've never used credit, or they just had a very limited history with it. So in this case, in order to demonstrate a positive credit history, you don't really have anything to go by. So you could sometimes use alternative credit sources, and lenders are going to determine what they allow. Frequently, that would be things like utility bills and showing that, based on their utilities, they've always paid their utility bills on time. Sometimes it could be a buy here, pay here lot that maybe they don't report to the credit bureau, but they'd be willing to provide a letter that this client has always paid on time. So alternative credit really is pretty broad. It could be different for anybody. It could be that maybe they've paid rent to a private landlord, but the landlord never, they don't report to the credit bureau. So it could just be a letter saying, look, this client has always paid their rent on time. So alternative credit might be useful for somebody who doesn't have any of those traditional credit lines established. And that way it still could allow them to demonstrate a positive credit history, even though they've got to use these alternative sources. So that can be done, and some lenders will accept that as an alternative if somebody really has no credit history that they could base a decision off of. Some examples that we might see of alternative credit, as I mentioned earlier, could be rent payments, utilities, cell phones. Those are a big one because the cell phone providers don't report monthly. They only report if you don't pay and go to collections. So you can get a copy of a cell phone bill to show that you've always paid it on time. Cable service, that would be another utility that may be useful. As I mentioned, a small business, that could even be like a rent to own where you're renting appliances or furniture. Occasionally we've seen it where it could be payments that you're making to a foreign country. So you can use that, but then keep in mind that that also means you're establishing that you have debt that you're paying, and then that's going to have to be calculated in that debt to income ratio. If you look in your book on page 37, you'll see some examples of alternative credit and a little more information related to that. So this will conclude the section on credit scores and credit reports.